So I would say the more you can study the biblical text, the more you can understand the language of it, the more you can appreciate the context, the more you will see God at work.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reclamation, a beEmboldened initiative. I am Naomi. I'm the founder and executive director here at BE, and we exist for those impacted by spiritual abuse by providing support for the prevention of victimization and revictimization. We do this by creating a safe place to ask the hard questions and to begin healing and rebuilding. Today, I am very honored to introduce you to a favorite professor of mine from Denver Seminary, where I recently graduated, Dr. Richard Hess. He is the Distinguished Professor of Old Testament and Semitic Languages at Denver Seminary. He is also the editor of the Denver Journal, which is Denver Seminary's online theological review journal. And if you've followed along with me and with beEmboldened for any length of time, you've likely heard me recommend this as a resource for finding solid resources. His research interests include Old Testament exegesis and theology, Hebrew and ancient and Near Eastern languages, biblical archaeology, and topics such as the transcendent value of human life and healing in biblical times. Dr. Hess has lectured at more than 100 scholarly societies, universities, and colleges. He is a member of the Committee on Bible Translation for the New International Version. He served as associate editor for the NIV Zondervan Study Bible. He has also worked as a translator for the New American Bible, the Holman Standard Christian Bible, the English Standard Version, and the Common English Bible translations of the Old Testament. He has authored 9 books, including another favorite of mine, The Old Testament, A Historical, Theological, and Critical Introduction, and has recently just started a new website, he said, just about a month ago. It's oldtestamentquestions.com, and here he answers questions submitted for response about the Old Testament. So he's in the process of creating this, what I went on the website already, and it's already an excellent resource, but I'm excited to see it grow. So please consider checking that out and submitting questions that you have, maybe follow-up questions from this episode you're listening to now. So with that background, Dr. Hess, I want to jump in with the first question here. What part does the Old Testament play within the overall greater book of the Bible?
Yes. Oh, and thank you, Naomi, for having me on, and appreciate having this opportunity to interact a little bit about the Old Testament. And that's a really good question. You shared that with me ahead of time, and I've thought about it, and I think it has so much of value. Of course, the Old Testament is really the larger part of the Bible by far, and so it forms in so many ways a foundation and background. But I think for many of us, especially as Christians, we identify very much with Jesus and with his life and with the call to discipleship and everything good there. But it's harder to identify with the Old Testament. It's a different culture. It's a different context in many ways, and a lot of what it has to say. It says strange things, and it's such a big book full of a jumble of different bits and pieces of information. And so it's a bit more foreign to us. And although Jesus is portrayed there, he's not doing and saying things like he is in the Gospels. He's not so much alive as we can identify with him there. Although I would say he is in some ways more special and more portrayed in the Old Testament than in the New. But I think to begin to answer that question, what part does it play? We have to see it first as a challenge, and both a challenge and an opportunity to kind of explore this world, because here is the story about who we are as created by God, who God is. Is he mean and nasty? Is he nice? And what kind of a God are we talking about? And what is that relationship? What is it that he has provided? And all of this forms a background for the New Testament the story of salvation there that is so important, but it also continues to speak to us today, because behind all this is a sense that God created us because he loved us, and he still loves us, and he will love us no matter what. And that love is already there in the Old Testament, and it becomes part of an understanding of God's continued work with us, and really the whole basis behind salvation. So those are just some general reflections.
Something you just said that stands out to me that I know our audience really struggles with is you mentioned how you really see Jesus in the Old Testament, and I can't remember exactly how you just phrased it, but would you be able to expand on that a little bit for people because it's so often missed?
Yeah, no, it is. You're right, and yet Jesus is there. On the one hand, we can talk a bit about how there is a presentation of what Jesus will, who he will be, and what he will do for us in the prophets. And they look forward to a coming of one, a sign, as Isaiah speaks in Isaiah 7:14. The Lord will give you a sign: a virgin will conceive and give birth to a child, and you shall call, and he will be called Emmanuel, God with us. And Micah 5:2, and the prophecy of coming from Bethlehem, and just a variety of things like this. And then you look further, and you see prophecies about one who will come, and he will do miracles and wonders, but also that Jesus will, in fact, as the suffering servant, come, and as Isaiah 53 says, he will suffer even though he had done nothing wrong. He will die. And Isaiah 53 ends by talking about a life beyond death. And I really believe that, you can go through a lot of the New Testament epistles and things and study about the significance of Jesus in terms of his death and what it means and his resurrection. But it's already there in a kind of a nutshell in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 53 and in some of the other prophecies. But I want to say even more, I think, profoundly and importantly, is the presence of Jesus when we come to the book of the Psalms. The Psalms are filled with interactions between the psalmist and God, and dealing with problems in life and crying out to God. Many of the Psalms, more than any other group, are laments, are weeping before God and asking for help in the midst of struggle. And then again and again, they end with the expectation or even the satisfaction of knowing that God has come and is present and is in one way or another helping. But there are also psalms of praise, there are psalms of joy, there are psalms that cover every aspect of life. And we could talk about these at length, but I mention these for a very special reason. In New Testament times, Jesus, in his life on earth, would have encountered the Psalms again and again. The Psalms would have been his hymn book of singing praises to God. They would have been his prayer book of praying before God and encountering God. When we read the Gospels, and they're very important, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we find there what Jesus did and said. And that's good, and that's valuable. But when we come to the Psalms, we find what he thought and felt. We find an interior life of Jesus. And if we truly desire to understand him and to know him and to live the life that he calls us to live like him as a disciple of his, then we go to the Psalms. We go to the Psalms and we let them be our prayer book, our hymn book, our way by which we may participate with him in that world of feeling, emotion, thinking that he knew.
Mm. This is so powerful for people who have met the wolves instead that are talked about in the New Testament, where they thought, okay, this is a leader. I'm coming under their authority, their spiritual authority, and they are interpreting scripture correctly and they have the good character and come to find out, no, they didn't.
Yeah.
People who were taken advantage of. And they can walk away feeling like, well, emotions aren't good and maybe I can't tell God, or I shouldn't get angry, or I shouldn't grieve, and I shouldn't, because they've been told so many things that just don't align with scripture. And so how you just compare that to, no, this is the internal of Christ. And something I've pointed out to people before is, the Psalms aren't in the Bible because they're showing us what not to do. They're not examples of, no, don't do this. This isn't okay. No, they're in there because they're modeling for us. And the Lord isn't responding by saying, shut up, pull yourself up, get it together. No, just move forward. That's not the response. It's I really appreciate how you just spoke to this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It comes again and again. There's no one in the Old Testament, no person for whom we don't see who in one way or another doesn't come short, doesn't sin, doesn't fail. And many are impacted by that. In some cases, we read of kings and leaders and others whose impact is destructive and really can be bad. But the interesting thing that I keep coming and encountering with the stories and scriptures and in the Psalms of the Old Testament is that for those who recognize that they have done wrong, or even who recognize simply they are in need of a savior, that God never says no. He never turns his back. He never refuses, no matter how wicked. I mean, the people of Nineveh were pretty wicked, but there comes Jonah and says, 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. And the king says, well, maybe if we repent, maybe if we wear our sackcloth, maybe if we cry unto God, maybe he will hear us. And he does, against Jonah, against even his own will, but he does hear us. He does hear the people of Nineveh. And the same way with David, who, had his own ways in his own life and did so many good things, but also, the story with Bathsheba and how he used his own power to get what he wanted. And that included murder. It included adultery. But he cries unto God because he knew that in the system that God had set up already in Leviticus for sacrifices, there was no sacrifice for an intentional sin of that sort. And there in Psalm 51, he says, you won't, I would bring all the sacrifices I could, but you won't accept those sacrifices. Zivkei Elohim ruach nishbara, leiv nishbar v'nidkeh Elohim lo tivzeh. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. Oh God, you will not despise. And that's all he had in that situation, and that's all he could bring. And there were ramifications and impact that would last his life and the life beyond, and life of others beyond that. But there was also forgiveness. There was also a willingness to forgive on the part of God.
Oh, do you say that is an excellent depiction of the forgiveness available to us? And yet, for those who have been abused, whatever kind of abuse it is, there is still justice, and they both can go hand in hand.
Yeah. There is, sorry, you say there is no justice.
No, there is also justice. I think we see that so well in the story of David, that there was
Yeah.
forgiveness, but there was also
Yeah.
justice for the wrong that had been done.
Yeah, there is an impact that does not, it goes on beyond the sin. There are the scars, there are the effects of it, and that's part of the world we live in. That comes about because of the fallen nature of the world and sin, and that is there, and sadly, that remains. I think. And there's no, I can't say, oh, well, we have a magic wand and it'll all go away. It won't. It is part of the life that we face. But part of the story of the gospel that leads to redemption and that leads to restoration in the end, which may be even beyond this life. But part of that story is that the one who gives that walked that road as well. And we read, of course, about it in the New Testament with Jesus and his suffering, the injustice of it and his death for no sin that he had committed. But you have to understand it's also there in the Old Testament as well. There are powerful expressions of God being really, really hurt and yet coming to a place where he forgives. I think one of the most important texts in the Old Testament for this is Exodus 32 to 34. God had just brought his people to Mount Sinai. He had just delivered them from the slavery of Egypt, and they had cried out under that oppression. And there is this wonderful picture of redemption, miraculous redemption, where it seemed they had no opportunity. There was no sense in which they would be delivered, but the seas literally part, and they walk through on dry ground, and their enemy is destroyed before their eyes, which could never have been imagined by anyone. And he brings them, as it were, to his mountain, and there he gives them that means of relationship. They are delivered, they are saved. They can, but now they have the opportunity to follow him, and he brings his blessing to them in the form of an ongoing relationship. So much so that in Exodus 24, they have a feast together with God. It says twice there in the first 11 verses, they saw God and they ate and they drank together. This great feast that is itself an anticipation of the joy that will come in the feast at the end of the age with Christ and the bridegroom and the bride of the church of who we are. But the one thing that he asks of them above all else is that they have no other gods before them. And you may know the story. Moses goes up the mountain, and there in the mountain he is receiving the law and how to build, in particular, laws that follow in the following chapters about how to build a tabernacle whereby God could go with them as he takes them to the land where he will give them as a gift. And while he's gone, just a few days, a few weeks, we don't know exactly, but while he's gone, they build a gold calf and they worship this calf. And it becomes the very first thing he told them not to do. And in the Bible, the word to be jealous, there are two ways that jealousy works in the Bible. That is, it seems, part of human nature, part of what God has given. One is jealousy in a marriage relationship where that could be, and the other broken, and the other is the jealousy of God for his people and of them for him, so that there's nothing in between. But here that's broken. Here they worship a gold calf. And can you imagine God having done all this? He is so heartbroken and so angry. He is so angry at the abuse that they have done toward him that he says to Moses, look, I know what they've done. You stand aside. I'm going to destroy them. I'll build a new people out of you. And there Moses, at the risk, of course, of his own life, but because of his love for the people, and he intercedes for the people. And he speaks to God and he says, no, don't do this. The other nations of the world, the rest of the world that will say, you only brought your people out here to destroy them. And your hope of blessing the nations already back in Genesis 12 that he had promised, your hope will be gone. And he says, all right, I won't. But I'm still hurt to the depths of his heart. And what he does is he says, all right, I won't, but you lead them into the I don't want to go with them. I don't want to have anything to do with them. And Moses says those famous words, if you do not go with us, we will not go. And there is a real sense in which God is persuaded to once again come back into a relationship with his people. And I'm not saying that that's true of everyone in terms of an abusive situation, but I want you to see that we serve a God who has gone through these kinds of experiences. The depth of God's heart and the forgiveness of them is so powerful that it's there in the Old Testament. And again, the people of God turn against him. And again, they, in many ways, are the actors, and he is the victim of abuse because he does. The greatest passage for me is, let me just pull it up here, Hosea 11. And in Hosea, the prophet of the heart and holiness of God speaks to his people, especially the northern kingdom of Israel, who have turned against him. He has sent them prophets. He has done miracles for them. He has performed healings. He has done everything. And yet they turn against him. And he says, how can I give you up, Ephraim? That's that kingdom. How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? These are the cities along with Sodom and Gomorrah that were destroyed because of their wickedness. My heart is turned over. This is God speaking. My heart is turned over within me. All my compassion is aroused. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I devastate Ephraim again. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One among you. I will not come against your cities, the cities of the north. In order to understand any hope that we have in abuse, I think we begin by understanding that we serve a God who knows something of that abuse and has experienced it. And so out of that and out of the depth of his love, his compassion is to be able to walk with us in a profound way. And I thought I wanted to share that with you.
Oh my goodness, I'm so thankful that you did.
Yeah.
These stories in the Old Testament, these accounts in the Old Testament, they build our evidence of this. We get to see over such a length of time how many times God forgave and forgave and forgave, and how many warnings and warnings and warnings. I think of Ezekiel with, laying on one side for 300 and something days and the other side. I mean, it's over 400 days. The man is laying on one side or the other.
Oh,
and
yes.
It's just that representation of the hundreds of years. I mean, my goodness, we don't want to forgive the same person twice. And so it adds so much richness and depth to the relationship of God with humanity over the course of time. And so I really appreciate how you're highlighting this.
Yeah. I think, I think of the example too of Joseph, who was, his brothers hated him, and when they were away from their father, and he comes to them in Genesis 37. They sort of jump on him. They want to kill him. And finally, they're persuaded by one of the brothers who is less inclined to hate to hate Joseph, to sell him into slavery. And along comes a caravan that they sell him to, or they give him to, and they take him down to Egypt, and he's a slave in Egypt. And there's a story, of course, of Potiphar and his wife, who Joseph faithfully serves as a slave, but then the wife of Potiphar desires to seduce him, and Joseph resists her, and then she accuses him and attacks him and says, he tried to attack me. He's the one who tried to assault me. And Joseph has no recourse, and so Potiphar, angry at him, puts him in prison and puts him away from his sight. And there is Joseph in prison, where again he serves faithfully before God, so that the warden of the prison gives him some charge and responsibility over the others there. And then there are some dreams that come up among the prisoners, and one he interprets correctly, saying that you, who are the chief butler, as it were, will rise again to serve your master, who is Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. And it happens, and that master then forgets about him. But then several years later, Pharaoh has a dream that he can't interpret, and the butler remembers Joseph, and they bring him out of prison. All those years of misused, mistreated, abused by everyone. And he interprets that dream. And the dreams are that there will be 7 years of plentiful food in Egypt, followed by 7 years of no food, nothing available. And so the Pharaoh is so impressed by his interpretation, and that he puts him in charge to collect all of the grain, all of the food that comes into Egypt, all the surplus during those 7 years. And he collects it all and administers it. And then come the 7 years of famine. And if you read in that text, in Genesis 45, 46, I think especially 47, it says there that all of Egypt was starving when there was no food, and Canaan as well was starving, so that these places would have had no food. The people would actually have died, or they would have had to run and flee somewhere else where they could find food. But they would have been entirely gone. But Joseph has the food, and he administers it, and he sells it to the people, and he works out so that everyone lives. And the people in Egypt live, and so do the people in Canaan who come there. And among those people are Joseph's brothers, and they come back, and eventually, after some interaction, they tell their father, your son Joseph, whom you love so much, is still alive. And so Jacob, in his old age, goes down to his son and is reunited with his son and spends his last years with him there in Goshen in Egypt. And then he dies, and the brothers are frightened because they bury their father and honor him, but then they're sure that Joseph will want to take revenge now, for his father is no longer there to protect them. And then at the end, in Genesis chapter 50, Joseph responds and says, no, I won't do that. I won't take revenge. Am I in the place of God? No. For what you intended to me for evil, and you did. God intended to work for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And these are the lives of all of the people who become Israel, but they're also the lives of all of Egypt and the lives of all of Canaan. I think sometimes that's overlooked, but that's what the text shows. And so the work of Joseph, such an abuse in so many ways, is to grow and be led by God. It's not always the case. I know that, but in this case, to be led by God to a place where he could give life to the very people who persecuted him. And by the way, the story really doesn't end there, because there arises a Pharaoh who forgets what Joseph has done. And by the beginning of Exodus, he's killing the male children of Israel and enslaving all of Israel again. And so they're back into, or not again, but they're back into being persecuted and enslaved. And in the north, when they leave Egypt, the Canaanites also come against them and sort of gang up against them in large coalitions of armies. In Joshua 10 and 11, who would wipe out all of Israel, except that God preserves them and keeps them alive miraculously. So it doesn't end sadly. But yet for Joseph, this was a story of redemption, not only of himself, but even of that generation of those who would have done so much evil toward him.
And so when you hear this struggle that people can have, which I would assume you've heard, that the God of the Old Testament looks so different than the God of the New Testament, what would you say in response? I think you're speaking to that, but I want to ask you very directly.
Yeah. I would say that there are two very fundamental characteristics to God that he reveals himself. God is holy, and that we find, he says it very clearly in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 in particular, but he says it again and again, I am holy. And he calls us to follow him in that way. That holiness of God doesn't change from Old Testament to New Testament. It's the same God, the same work, the same holiness. And from the beginning, when God creates the world, he sets up these examples by separating the sky, the dry land, the waters. And he says, yes, and there are certain things that I want to separate, because that's teaching and understanding of who I am, and because that will be the best life for you by which I can bring life. And he does that through the Old and New Testament. And the other essential characteristic is that God is love. 1 John 5 is a great example of that in the New Testament. But again and again, I mean, I've tried to suggest already that there are a number of examples where God is love in the Old Testament. Without his love, Israel would never have survived. And his love to establish a covenant after the flood with Noah, where he says, for all people of the world, I will never destroy the world again in this way. Where he says to Abram, I want you to come out and follow me so that through you, I can be a blessing to all nations of the world. I can bless them. And Israel, in his covenant there at that mountain at Sinai, he says, I want to bless you, and I want you to be a priesthood so that through you all nations will be blessed. And with David as king, he says, through you, I will bring one who will come, and there will always be someone to rule over my people from your line. And ultimately, that is Jesus himself who comes. So there is this love of God that is there, and this holiness of God that is there, because God is not equal to the world. He is not the world. He is separate from the world. And in some sense, that's what he calls us to as well, which is tough. It's difficult, because God is able to bring love and holiness together perfectly, and we are not. We fail. And going back to the Garden of Eden and the beginning in Genesis, all of the sins are part of that failure to understand what God calls us to. The holiness has to include a respect for other people and for who you are, who I am, our ability to choose and to make decisions and not to be forced into things that we don't want. And yet the love of God includes that forgiveness and that power. And it's there in the Old Testament. Again and again, he forgives Israel. Again and again, he forgives the people of even the Assyrians in Nineveh. And you have this wonderful story. You know the story in the prophet Hosea. Hosea is called by God to marry a woman named Gomer. This woman is we don't know exactly her story, but as one person has said, she is a woman with a past, and she comes into this married relationship, and he loves her. But as the chapter goes on, by the end of chapter 1 and into chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, Gomer has left Hosea, and she has gone out, and she has become involved with lots of other men and involved in all kinds of ways. And she has been reduced to the status of a slave. And God says to Hosea, you go out again, you find Gomer, and you buy her back. And that's what he does. And the story is so profound because it says there, he bought her for so many shekels or whatever it is in terms of silver, but also for barley and other things. There are these additional units. And you can imagine Hosea, who was not a rich man, going back and cleaning out his bank account and then taking what was ever left as well in his house, gathering it together and bringing it there to pay to buy back Gomer. And he buys her back and brings her back into his house. And he says, we will remain apart for a certain period of time so that we can again grow to trust one another in that relationship before, but then we will come together again. And God says, this story that you have lived is my story, because that's exactly what Israel has done to me. It has turned against me, even though I loved it. And the people of God have gone away. And now I am going out and I will buy them back from that exile that they have gone into. And I will bring them back and I will love them again. Because my love has never departed, is never left, but I will show that love to them again. So yeah, there is a God of love in the Old Testament. There is one there. And there is a God of holiness in the New Testament. You just read Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
There are a couple of examples that I hear brought up fairly regularly where people will come along, and see, okay, yes, I can see that God is love. I can see, but what do I do with these couple of stories? And please correct my pronunciation if I'm forgetting and I'm saying this wrong. But one is the story of Uzzah in 2 Samuel 6, 3-8.
Mm-hmm.
With touching the ark. And the other one is the story of Kora in Numbers 16, where the ground opens up. And that one was a little bit less. That one's usually a little bit less about Kora himself and a little bit more about the whole family.
Mm-hmm.
Although Kora can still come into play. It's like, okay, well, was there grace there? What would that look like? But more so, it's okay. What about the kids? What about making sense of that? So, would you mind talking about each of these stories one at a time and sharing what maybe could people not be understanding well here that could be helpful?
Yeah. No, these are issues and concerns that arise, and I don't want to minimize them, but there are a couple of considerations perhaps that may at least help in balancing out the story. I think with Korah, I think the family, there are a number of situations like this where a family stands under condemnation in part because of one person who seems to be the one responsible. So you got Korah, who clearly is in a position of rebellion against authority, and Nathan, Aviram, a number of different figures there. Usually they're male, although you do have Miriam at one point who stands against Moses, but in this case they are male, and they are in fact really in a position of rebellion against not so much the authority of Moses, but the authority of Aaron as high priest. What right does he have to be high priest and to function in this way and to do the sorts of things that he does? And one of the things about the Bible is it's important to realize what we know and what we don't know. And we don't know everything about all the motivations, all the involvement, all the engagement, even of the families that are there that may have taken place. But what we do know is that the rebellion does take place. There are several hundreds of people involved in as it comes to it in this rebellion, and they're in numbers, and there's this challenge. Well, what's going to happen? And so God says, well, put the rods of your authority, as it were, that you claim, and Aaron will put his rod, and they will be placed before me in the tabernacle, and I will choose. I will show you. This is what we will see who has the right authority, as it were, and it's Aaron, of course, whose rod buds and produces life in a way that shows that Aaron is the living figure and the figure of life giving to the rest of the congregation by his actions, by his life, and it's not Korah and it's not his associates. But then God says an interesting thing, and you can read it yourself, but he says, all of those who are not with Korah stand away from him and stand away from his place. And I don't know how to interpret that other than that there are anyone who did not join with Korah, including the rest of the people, including their families, including the others, could have stood away. There is this opportunity. Now you can argue, well, they were very in solidarity with him and so forth, and maybe they were, but they had seen all that had taken place. And they had already been, for several years, or at least for months, perhaps longer than that, they had seen the miracles that God had given. They had seen Aaron being selected and being chosen. They had seen all of these events that led up to this point. And so this rebellion is not without a context. And I think that I have no idea if some of his own family and some of the others did, in fact, at that point leave and join with the rest of Israel and step away, because when Korah gets swallowed up and all with him, it's those who not only had seen all these things, but had intentionally decided to remain with Korah. And that, I believe, would include all those other people. Now, you say, well, what about the young children and things like this? But the children would have been with the parents, and the parents would have made those decisions. And that included the mothers, the older sisters, whoever might also have been involved, and who would have been, in the first instance, the most responsible, the most connected with the children, especially the young children who could not have made a decision on their own. So I just like to balance that out a little bit as we see that judgment coming down. It is a judgment not only of Korah and some of the others who had actually led the rebellion, but also those who had continued to stay with it no matter what. And so I would just say that. I don't want to take away from the fact that there is a judgment of God, and it comes, and that there are strong family ties, and that you have to you recognize that. But in a context like that, it's hard for me to think that these people did not have the opportunity, if they had felt that God, who is God and what has he chosen and what has he done, and they could have joined the rest of Israel, I think. That when we come to Uzzah, we come to a slightly different context and a different story, but it's the same idea. There is a picture there in 1 Samuel, and then it comes into 2 Samuel 6, which is the story of Uzzah, of the Ark of the Covenant of God. And the Ark of the Covenant of God is a sort of a box of gold. And that ark represents the presence of God among his people. But it's not a guaranteed surety. There's a real sense in which Israel here puts God in a box and is always in danger of this. You go back to the opening chapters of 1 Samuel and you see the sons of Eli, the sons of Eli, who are, Eli's the priest. He's the one who's connected with God, and these sons will follow as priests as well, but they're corrupt. They're doing everything wrong. They're taking advantage of their position to manipulate it, to have authority over the people, to corrupt and to engage in improper relations with people who come to there to offer sacrifices, the women as well. It's a bad scene. And so there comes this battle with the Philistines who come against Israel. And it looks like it's going to be a really tough battle. So what do the sons of Eli do? Well, they take the Ark of the Covenant out of where it's supposed to always be, in the most holy place in the tabernacle, and they run with it to the war. And the Philistines see this and they're scared and they say, oh no, the very Ark of the Covenant of God has come. Now surely God will fight for them, but he doesn't, because God will not be manipulated in this way. He will not be abused in this way, and he will not be turned against his will by anybody, including the sons of the high priest. And so the sons of the high priest are killed. Israel loses that battle, and the ark is taken into the hands of the Philistines. And they take it into their most holy place, into their temple, and there they worship the image Dagon. And so it's put in with Dagon as though Dagon is now Lord over the Ark of the Covenant of God, but it doesn't work that way for them either. You can't put God in a box and decide what you will do with him. And so the Philistines wake up and Dagon, the statue's fallen down, and his feet and his arms and legs, everything is broken. It's not good. This can't be God, the right thing. So they take the Ark of the Covenant out and they move it around from city to city among the Philistines. And in the end, finally, they say, everywhere we go, there are problems. The last place we've come now, people are getting tumors and other things, and they're dying. We don't want this. This is clearly a curse of the God of Israel. So say, okay, we will get rid. What can we do with this? Well, let's get rid of it and send it back to Israel. So they send it back to Israel on a cart with oxen. They send gold gifts and special shapes of the tumors and other things. And this is the way the Philistines and the Greeks tend to do it. They even do it today in that cultural tradition. But anyway, they send it back with all of these images or all of these objects, and it goes back. And it comes to the men of Beth Shemesh, which is where, and 70 of them are killed because they mistreat the ark. Now, by that point, it's pretty clear that the Ark of the Covenant is something that's very sacred and very holy, and you can't manipulate it and abuse it, and you got to be really, really careful with how you treat it. You don't touch the ark. If you want to die, that's a good way to do that. There are poles and other ways by which you carry the ark, which they were instructed to do all the way back in Exodus concerning how it was to be built and what was to be done. And there were certain things you were to do in terms of handling it. And so it goes and it stays for 20 years, in Kiryat Yearim, which is west of Jerusalem. There's a place called Kiryat Yearim, which is probably close by. You can visit it today. It's a town, but it stays there, and it's carefully kept there among and reserved and blessed, and the house anyway. And so the people are blessed. And David comes along 20 years later after this event, and or so, and he says, well, I want to bring this back to Jerusalem. We want to build a temple. We want God. And so David comes down, and there's all kinds of celebration, and they pick up the ark properly. They set it on a cart with drawn by oxen, and they take that very carefully with them, and they're moving it back to, or they're moving it to Jerusalem, where it will ultimately come and rest. But along the way, the oxen stumble, and a man named Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark. Now, you would think just by itself that would be a good thing, but all of the lesson up until this point has been that there is a holy God, and you don't just touch the ark. You don't do that. And so the way I would think in which it would be to steady it would have been to grab hold of the poles and to take those poles in such a way as to steady it. But that is not what Uzzah did. He sort of dared to touch the ark, knowing all that he had known. And in that place at that time, it was not to be done. And in this case, he died as a result of it. The result of touching the ark. It made David so angry that he went off and he stopped the whole procession at that point. And the ark actually stayed with a man called Obed-Edom there at his house. And it says, for the years that it was there, God blessed Obed-Edom, or the days, or however long it was there. We're not sure exactly, but God blessed him. So the ark was both an instrument of blessing, but also an instrument of judgment for those who misused it and abused it. And finally, it comes before God, and it comes into, and David does finally take it and bring it into Jerusalem with lots of rejoicing and praise once he gets over that anger that he has. But that's the way God is. You know, in the New Testament, we're told that we have the opportunity to come before God in a truly intimate relationship and call him our Father. And even at one point they say Abba, Father. And Abba, yes, it's sometimes translated daddy, that we can call him in this kind of a close relationship. But it's daddy in the sense of a closeness and an openness as a daughter or as a son. But it's not daddy in the sense of being flippant. And there is always this respect that we have before God, and that goes back to the Old Testament. So those are some thoughts in terms of how I would understand these accounts.
And something that you're highlighting is we really have to back up when we're reading. It's not just reading that paragraph. I mean, we've got to really back up and get, okay, what's the best picture we can get from what we know?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, are there any other sort of considerations that you would say people should have when they're reading the Old Testament in order to get as accurate of a picture as possible?
Well, yes, I really think what you say there with regards to context and with regards to understanding of it is just so important. We see it just really again and again with regards to who God is and how he responds and acts towards people. And the better that we can understand that, the more I think we have an understanding of how God will work. You have there are a number of events that people point to, you know, of this sort of thing. And I've spent a lot of time talking about the destruction of the Canaanites and what about the genocide? Wasn't that unfair? But then you have the story of Rahab, and you have the story of this wonderful reclamation of somebody who actually believes. And when you actually look in the detail, point by point, with the Canaanites, you find that there is no example where any Canaanite non-combatants are really put to death. There is no specific statement like that in the book of Joshua. What we have again and again is the armies that come to destroy Israel, who are then beaten back. And even in the account of Jericho, I believe Jericho, given its situation, given its context, its description, both in the Bible and what we know of Canaan at that time in terms of the archaeology, the site of Jericho, it was a small site. It could not have been more than a couple acres in size. And I believe it was primarily a fort. The only specific people we have who are mentioned, who are there, are combatants, are military, other than Rahab and her family. And Rahab and her family are saved thanks to the confession of Rahab. She really represents her family in that way and leading them to salvation. And they're all saved. And that was there and possible. And in no place are we ever told that that wasn't available to anyone who would come and seek out Israel. But what we have instead are the kings and the armies that come and fight against them. And they're destroyed because it's either they're going to win and destroy Israel, or Israel will win. And God fights for Israel. And it says, I know it says in Joshua 6 that it says, it's often translated, men and women, old and young, were put to death or destroyed there at Jericho. But the words actually are not quite that. In the language of in the Hebrew language, it's from man to woman. And it's used a number of times in the Bible as a simply stereotypical expression for saying everyone who was there. And I believe it was military. And they walked around Jericho 7 days in order to allow them to be delivered, to see if there was any opening. And the only opening, there was one. The only opening was at Rahab and her window, out of which there was a red cord. But the verb to walk around is exactly the verb used in the Psalms of go around Jerusalem and admire its fortifications. In other words, inspect it. And this was a ceremonial inspection to see whether anyone in Jericho was willing to allow themselves to present themselves before the God of Israel. And they weren't. And then the last day, 7 times they do it. And by the way, that suggests it wasn't that large of a city, because let's face it, you can't go around something 7 times in a whole day like they did. I think it was a relatively small fort. And so in the end, God, he actually knocks down the walls. And yes, then the combatants are destroyed. And I see this again and again. We have lots of examples of where it can be taken as though God's a really mean God destroying. But when you actually look at the context, he's not. What he's doing is he's providing opportunity and mercy, and then it's the decision of the combatants, and usually it's the armies that come after him, God, or the people of God. Another one that's famous is in 2 Kings. I think it's chapter 2, where you have the so-called youths who come out and mock Elisha as he's returning. Get up, Baldy, get up, they say. And he curses them, and bears come out and maul 42 youths. Well, that's a very interesting text for a whole lot of reasons. But they come out of Bethel. Now Elisha has just come from Jericho, where he's taken waters that produce death because they were poisonous, and he's miraculously made them drinkable so that the people can live there and prosper. And they have such gratitude. He will go from Bethel to provide life for all kinds of people. He will raise people from the dead. He will do all kinds of things. So what's he doing here? Well, first of all, the term is ne'arim ketanim, these youths. In the Hebrew, it's described, which the word there is yes, it often means young person, but it can and does mean a person who knows what they're doing. These are not just little boys or something like that. These are, in fact, Solomon says when he becomes king, I am but a young person, like he uses the same terms. Jeremiah says how he is a young person, using language there like what you have in Second Kings. But these are people who clearly have the ability to think for themselves and to decide what they're going to be. I don't see this as a wandering little group of nursery school boys who are girls who somehow escaped from their teachers and started laughing at Elisha. I see it as a group of at the youngest teenagers and older who came out of a context of what is a center of false worship at Bethel, where they had a gold calf that they worshiped quite regularly at this time, and they were mocking and belittling Elisha for what he was and what he represented. And so, while I don't want to minimize the seriousness of what happened, I do think that they knew what was going on. So I would say the more you can study the biblical text, the more you can understand the language of it, the more you can appreciate the context, the more you will see God at work. And I'm not in this trying to say everything was sweet and wonderful. It's not. Look at the account of Judges, and there at the end of Judges, what is more horrible than the abusive treatment of the concubine, the Levite's concubine, there at the end in chapter 19, who is raped and given over to being raped and effectively murdered. And what does the Levite do? But he goes back home and cuts up her body like Saul later would an ox, which is a way of sending, and then sends it out to the tribe saying, come join or you will be dead like this ox. But I mean, in a horrible manner, making a woman who's so abused in this way. I cannot imagine a worse treatment in a book that starts out with a figure of women like Oxa negotiating with Caleb for water rights for her family, that has Deborah, who is a leader and an honored woman in Israel, that has Yael, or Jael, as she's sometimes called, who fights for Israel, even though she is the wife of a Kenite and not even an Israelite, and kills Sisera, the general who was going after Israel to destroy it. And so point after point after point, you have these women who do mighty things and are engaged in all kinds of a variety. The society is much more flexible in terms of what happens. But because as it goes forward, everyone does what is right in their own eyes, there are also these terrible situations where you have people who are doing their own thing and abusing others. And that's the example in Judges 19. There is no greater one than that. And what did the tribes? They come together, and rather than saying, well, bring out the men who did this so that we can kill them or execute judgment on them, the Benjaminites, who are the tribe of which Gibeah was part of where all of these terrible things took place, say, no, we won't. We will fight against you. And so you have the Benjaminites against everybody else in Israel, and you have a civil war. And in the end, the Benjaminites are almost entirely wiped out. There's a few hundred of them left. And the Israelites say, well, we don't want a tribe to be entirely lost. So you Benjaminites, you can go over to Jabesh Gilead across the Jordan River, because nobody came from Jabesh Gilead to help us. You can kill the people there, and you can take their virgins, their daughters, and you can make them wives for yourself. And that's what they do. And then there still aren't enough wives, so they allow them to go and basically kidnap women at Shiloh when a festival takes place, so that there would be wives. It's just a horrendous story that ends Judges, and that's why it's so wonderful that set next to that is Ruth, which is love story set in the time of Judges, and you come to the end of Judges, and what's interesting is we don't know the names of these people. There are no names given to the Levite, his concubine, the people who are fighting one versus the other. It's anonymous. These people have it's almost as though they have surrendered their identity or have it taken from them in the case of the concubine. But I mean, in these other cases, they have just given it up. They no longer have an identity. And so that's how that civil war is degenerated. But then on the other side, in the story of Ruth, read the first 5 verses of Ruth, and you have name after name after name. It's not just Naomi and Ruth, but it's their husbands, their the other daughter-in-law of Naomi, and you're inundated with names because suddenly you have identity, and you have people who really have a life and a meaning for that life. And yes, it's tragic what goes on there in terms of famine and in terms of the death of the men. But in the end, out of that comes life and new meaning to life. They go back to Bethlehem. Ruth marries Boaz, and together they give birth to children, and the line is established and continues. Anyway, I got into that, but I just wanted to, I wanted to show that there are, I in no way would minimize the terrible things that take place, just as there are terrible things that take place today. God help us. But there are also ways in which God continues to work. And there are ways in which I think he wants us to hear him and his compassion.
Well, and something we talk about with people here at beEmboldened is placing the accountability where it goes. And so if people made these horrific decisions, that doesn't mean that we put that accountability onto the Lord. These
Right.
people made these decisions. And I think that contrast you just pointed out is really noteworthy because we're talking about a time period, correct me if you disagree or add anything on, but we're talking about a time period where names mattered and genealogy mattered, and there was honor connected with a family bloodline. And we really see the importance when we read all these genealogies. It's like begot, begot, begot. Like, why do we have all of this in here? And, but there's a real importance, put on people's names and their family, their family lines and these things. And so you're right to see at the end, we don't have any of that. And yet then we're going to highlight this one family. We're going to, wow, what a contrast again between the two.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And this is where the identity lies. It lies in the family. It lies in the construction of those families, and it lies in their continuation. And so many of the laws, some of which seem odd and strange to us, are all designed to provide for not only the family and its continuation, but those who are the most vulnerable in the families. The widows, the orphans, those who are cut off from such things, that they can come into these families, or they already are, and they have a place and they have certain rights and privileges within that family that are there for that life, to maximize that life and to maximize the life-giving nature of it in generation after generation. I mean, in one sense, you think of like the woman caught in adultery in the New Testament, but you think in the Old Testament of a figure like Rahab, who is described as a prostitute, who is described as one who many would despise, and yet she is the one who gives what I believe in Joshua 2, verses 9 to 11, is the most profound confession of faith virtually in the whole Old Testament. Because if Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. in the Old Testament, the salvation event was the Exodus, and that's the very thing she confesses and begins by saying, God is God, and winds up, God is God in heaven above and on the earth below, and God is the one who has brought you in. The Lord, the Lord of Israel, Yahweh, has done this. And she gives such a clear confession there. There isn't anything clear in that. And then she goes on to negotiate for her family, as I said, and she doesn't have a husband, but she talks about her brothers, her sisters, her mother, her father, that God would preserve them. And that's what they agree to. And in Joshua 6, which is the great story of Jericho, and, it's the old Sunday school story of the Israelites defeating Jericho. But if you actually take that story and read just that story of the Israelites conquering Jericho, interwoven with that is the rescue of Rahab and her family. And I think there are something like 104 words in Hebrew that describe the destruction of Jericho there. And again, interwoven with them, there are 80-some words that describe the rescue of Rahab and her family. In other words, to the author and to what God wants to say, the rescue of Rahab and the salvation of Rahab is as important as the destruction of Jericho. And she is brought into Israel, and she comes in. And of course, as you know, you don't have to even read the Old Testament. You can read the New Testament and the genealogy in Matthew there. She becomes part of the line that goes right down to Jesus, who is born. So Rahab does marry. She does have children, and that is part of her heritage. And it's just so important, I think, to understand that God is not done with us, that he loves us with an everlasting love, and that love continues. And he has plans for us.
For those who will listen or watch this episode, I hope that this conversation highlights how, first, the beauty of this whole meta narrative, the beauty in the Old Testament as well as in the New, because many of our audience, like myself, come from a background where the Old Testament was used to create an unhealthy fear of God, not the healthy fear of God, but the I'm just terrified of God and I'm afraid that if I don't take the right quote unquote job, I might be damned. I mean, this kind of fear of like, I'm trying to please and it's terrifying, and any misstep, there isn't the grace, the doomsday aspects, the control, and so it's a mess. And what you've spoken to today, again, I hope it highlights that the first mistake done in these situations is that scripture wasn't read and interpreted correctly, because that's not actually the God that we see in the Old Testament. And so that's the first error that we have there.
Yeah. Oh, it's so, so important. You go back to the very beginning, it says in the beginning that God created humanity, created each of us in his image and likeness. We're the only image and likeness of God, but we all have that. Genesis 9:6 reaffirms that after the flood. There could be no greater sins than the violence that spread abroad in Genesis 6 that brought about the flood. Yet God really, in his mercy, and that's a whole other story, rescued Noah and his family. They come off the ark, and he reaffirms there, he says, you can't go around murdering people innocently in Genesis 9:6. Because you are each created in the image of God and you have that eternal value. We are each of such a value that value transcends any amount of gold or silver, any amount of material things in this world. It is truly that we are of God. Therefore, it is out of that value, out of coming to terms that we really do have a value before God, that we are called to live. And that goes all the way back to the first covenant, the first relationship with Noah, with his family. And from there, according to Genesis 10, all the nations of the world come. So we're all created in that image of God, male and female. We all have that value. And it is out of that value that we first recognize, in a sense, it's, loving ourselves, coming to accept that we really are of worth before God, of such worth that we can begin to receive the love of God and then receive the love and love others.
Hmm. And so when we go to the Old Testament and we open the scriptures and we start to read, for those of you who go and you see a God who is only wrathful, consider that you're seeing it because that's what you've been told. And please reconsider. And if we go to the text and we instead approach it with the posture of, okay, well, who are you, God? I want to know, and I'm going to read, and let's see what's in here. Let's see what I find. I'd offer that you're going to find something very different.
Yeah, no, it is. I think one of the most important verses that I mentioned back at the beginning of our conversation is when God is persuaded to love his people Israel, even after they had betrayed him in the deepest and most terrible way. And he reveals himself to Moses in Exodus 34:6, and he says, the Lord, his personal covenant name, Yahweh, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And these words are words that remain true of God when he created us, when he created Israel, and throughout every covenant relationship. It is that upon which is the foundation that Jesus comes and dies on the cross, that he is willing and out of his love to die, because this is who God is from the beginning.